We were discussing the case of a machshavas pigul at the time of the shechita of the korban toda, and how would it or would it not impact upon the lechem, the lachmei toda. And what we mentioned was, on the bottom here of page Yutes, was that if the Kohen, when he shechted the korban toda, he had in mind the machshavas pigul, which means that he's going to be zorik the dami, the chutzim komo, chutzim zmano, then the lechem itself becomes pigul, just like the zevach. The zevach and the lechem are one entity. They're husband and wife, and whatever impact you have on the zevach, automatically it spills over onto the lechem, and the lechem becomes pigul in the same way that the zevach becomes pigul. In the case of shalol l'shma, where the Kohen who did the avodah of the korban toda, the adam achshav shalol l'shma, then we have halacha that ein halechem is kaddish. In other words, the machshavas shalol l'shma is much more fundamental of a psul in the negative sense, such that it doesn't register, and it cannot have any impact whatsoever on the lachmei toda. And therefore, the lachmei toda will not become pigul in a case of machshavas shalol l'shma. Now let's take the case of nimtzeis treifa. That was the last case we discussed yesterday. After the shechita of the zevach, they discovered that the zevach was a treifa. And once again, we would say that the sul in the shechita makes it into chisaron shechita. It's as if there was no shechita whatsoever, because in Kodshim, the shechita of a treifa is not considered a shechita. It doesn't register, and therefore it has no impact on the lachmei toda. However, the issue is what happens in the case where after the shechita of the zevach, we discover that the zevach has a bal mum. Do we say, like the case of treifa, that the shechita is meaningless and therefore doesn't impact on the lechem, or no, the shechita does register? And here we have a machlokas between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we have a case now of im olu lo yered. What does that mean? In the world of Kodshim, there's some cases where, although the korban is possible, but if it was brought on the mizbeach, we're not going to take it out of the mizbeach. That's called im olu lo yered. And that applies in the case of a balmum over, which means that even though the animal, as it turns out, that was shechted and there was a zrikas adam, it was found to be a balmum, that blemish is not a permanent blemish. And the difference is that if it was a permanent blemish, which is called a mum she'eno over, then even if olu yerd, but if it's a mum ha'over, then the law is in olu lo yerd, which means that it still is considered within the constellation of Kodshim. And an event that was brought on the mizbeach, we will continue with the avodah, we'll do the aktor al gabi mizbeach as if it was a korban kosher, because of the principle of him olu lo yerd. Therefore, Rabbi Eliezer argues that in this case, the lechem is impacted by the shechita. And the reason for that is because the shechita itself is potentially a shechita kshera within the world of Kodshim. And the nafkamita would be in a case of an olu, because it's a mum she'eno over, a mum she'over. On the other hand, Rabbi Yeshua says, lo is kaddish al lechem, because there already was a psul that was established immediately at the time of the shechita, meaning after the shechita they discovered the mum. And if that mum was there before the shechita, because we have no reason to believe otherwise, so at the moment that he shechted the animal, he shechted a bal mum. Now it's true that because Tzabalmu over and Olulo Yeret, but that doesn't matter because we look at the situation as of the moment of Shechita. And the moment of Shechita, the Shechita was defined and classified as a Shechita Psula, no less than the previous case of Treifa, and therefore Lois Kaddish al Lechem. The Shechita does not have the power to impact on the Lechem because it's a Shechita that's completely invalid. Although, again, as Rabbi Eliezer insisted, it's not totally invalid. It did accomplish something because in event of him Olu Lo Yerdu, but Rabbi Yeshua looks at the moment of Shechita, and if we freeze that frame in time, what we have is a Shechita Psula. And therefore it doesn't impact to be Mekadosh the Lechem. Now, everything that we said until now to explain the machlokes between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. But now we move on to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda as far as Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua are concerned. Lo nechleku Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, ela b'shachat b'machsheves chutzlim koma. Now we know that a machshav of chutzlim komo is not as profound, not as severe of a psul as machshavas chutzlim zmana. So what does Rabbi Yehuda gain here by placing the machlokes in a new light? The machlokes that we discussed between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua only applies in a machshavas chutzlim komo. He says in that case, we can really justify the position of Rabbi Eliezer that is Kaddish al Lechem. And Rabbi Yeshua says, Lo is Kaddish al Lechem. And why Lo is Kaddish al Lechem? Sarei ein b'machshava zu kares ki machshavas chutzim zmano. Now this is counterintuitive. Because the way Rabbi Yehuda understands Rabbi Yeshua is going to say Lo is Kaddish al Lechem and Dafka because the machshava was a machshava of chutzlim komo. Why would the machshava of chutzlim komo, according to Rabbi Yeshua, invalidate the machshava, invalidate the shechita, and therefore Lo is Kaddish al Lechem? And you're going to tell me because in the case of a machshava of chutzlim komo, it doesn't generate a pigul in the highest, most severe level of a chiv kares if you eat the basar. The adaram, that would seem to indicate that the shechita is more of a valid shechita. Meaning, if you're going to put on a scale the following two cases, the two scenarios, two types of shechita. One is a shechita with a machshava that the zrika should be chutzlim zmano, the other where the machshava is chutzlim komo. Which of the two is more of a psul in the shechita? Which of the two shechitos is less valid, if you will, is further away from being a good shechita? It would be chutzlim zmano, because chutzlim zmano generates a full-fledged pigul with a chiv kares. That's not a shechita. And what Rabbi Yehuda wants to say is the following, that we're going to judge and weigh the two shechitos, one of a machshava chutzlim zmano and the other of chutzlim komo, not by the chiv kares per se, but rather by the impact on the basar. And the fact that in the case of chutzlim zmano there is a chiv kares, therefore, it has an impact on the basar, because now if somebody eats the meat of the carbon, he's chayiv kares. In such a case, says Rabbi Yeshua, niskadish al lechem. Why is niskadish al lechem? After all, this psul in the shechita is even worse and more severe and more fundamental than chutzim komo. But the answer is, who hanosen, he hanosenes. That because of this tremendous chumrah of a machshava chutzim zmano, that we can measure in the fact that now the basar is also b'pigul with an itzakares, that means that the shechita did register. It did have an impact. And if it had an impact on the basar, then it's going to have an impact on the lechem and kiddush al lechem in the case of lachmei toda. Where does Rabbi Yeshua disagree with Rabbi Eliezer? In the case of machshava chutz l'mkoma, because in the case of machshava chutz l'mkoma, it's a pasal shchita, and it doesn't have an impact on the basal. And therefore, if you eat the basal, you don't violate the Isur Pigul with a chi of kares. Says Rabbi Yeshua, in such a case, I am going to say that lo niskadish alechem. Why lo niskadish alechem? Because a machshav of chutzim komo doesn't have, it's in the paradigm, but it doesn't have the impact on the basar. And if it doesn't have the impact on the basar, then likewise it doesn't have an impact on the lechem. Okay, now we get to the following. How many lechamim are there if we add them all together, the total number in the case of lachmei toda? The answer is 40. We have 4 minim. Each min comprises 10 lechamim. For some unknown reason, our Baal HaToda, the Bailam of this Korban Toda, made a decision that he wants to double the number of lachmei toda. Instead of 40, he wants 80. And somehow, I don't know exactly how, he convinced the Kohen to bring 80 lachmei toda. So the Kohen shechs the Korban Toda with a machshava that he's going to be mekadesh not 40 lechamim, but 80 lechamim. Chizkiah says that there's only a power and a potential to be mekadesh 40 lechamim. The Torah doesn't recognize 80 lechamim. Therefore, when the 80 lechamim are brought to the Mikdash, 40 out of the 80 are sanctified as lachmei toda, and the other 40 are not. Because the zevach cannot be mekadesh more than a maximum of 40 lechamim. But obviously the question that we're going to get to in a minute, which 40 out of 80 are sanctified with kedushas lachmei toda? Rabbi Yochanan disagreed, and he says the entire procedure of kiddush halechem is invalid. Throw it out. If the Kohen had in mind that through the shchitas hazevach he'd be mekadesh 80 lechamim, he didn't succeed in being mekadesh even one single lechem. It's like an all or nothing proposition. So this is a machlokas of what we call first generation Amoraim, Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. Now we get to second generation Amoraim. And that's going to be Rabbi Zera and Abaye. Rabbi Zera and Abaye are now going to analyze, they're going to dissect the machlokas between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to start with Rabbi Zera. Here's the language of Rabbi Zera. He says, "Im Omar Yiskadshu Arbaim Mitoch Hashmonim." He says that if you're going to claim that there is a possibility of sanctifying 40 from the 80, 40 out of the 80, then L'divrei Hakol, even Rabbi Yochanan would concede that 40 out of the 80 became lachmei toda. They were sanctified with the status of lachmei toda. So what does that mean? That the Kohen knew very well, according to Rabbi Zera, in the first scenario, that this zevach, the Korban Toda, has a potential of maximizing 40 lechamim. The Kohen, therefore, had a machshava, and he declared it just as much, that 40 out of the 80 would become lachmei toda. Says Reb Zera, in that case, where the Kohen explicitly declares that 40 out of the 80 will be kadosh b'kedushas lachmei toda, even Reb Yochanan will agree that that's what's going to happen. 40 out of the 80. Im Omar lo yiskadshu arboim, ela im kain yiskadshu bo kol hashmonim. In the other extreme case, the Kohen, based on the request of the Bailam, says it's all or nothing in the opposite direction. Either all 80 lechamim will be kadosh, or none of them will be kadosh. Is kuliyama pligi? In such a case, even Chizkiah would agree that none of the lechamim are kadosh, because there's no possibility in this case of being makadosh 80 lechamim. So keep pligi. So where is the battlefield according to Reb Zera between Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah? Hifrish stam. He was mafresh 80 lechamim. Lo amar klum. He didn't say, well, 40 out of the 80 will be kadosh. He didn't say all 80 have to become kadosh, or none of them are kadosh. It's just a stama case. And Chizkiah understood that in a stama case, what he meant was 40 out of 80. And Rabbi Yochanan understood that in a stama case, he meant all 80, all or bust. L'das Chizkiah, ain't kavanos l'kadesh kulam. We assume that he's a big scholar, and he realizes full well that when he brought 80, he cannot be makadesh all 80. He can only be makadesh maximum 40. Is therefore only 40 out of the 80 will be kadosh. And that's like the case of Mefarish, where he said explicitly, here are the 80. I want 40 out of the 80 to be lachmei toda. And everybody agrees in that case he can do so. And that's the sheet of Chizkiah, that in his stomach, we assume that he's not an ignorant person. He doesn't have in mind something which is impossible, to be makadesh 80 lechamim and bring them all as lachmei toda. There ain't no such thing. So obviously, in the case of his stomach, if we make we do a psychological evaluation of what he had in mind, he had in mind 40 out of the 80. And it's as if he had said explicitly 40 out of the 80. So why is he bringing 80 lechamim? Did that question occur to you? So for this, we have to introduce a concept which is very big in Kodshim, which is called achrayus. Achrayus means that very often when a person takes upon himself a neder and a dava to bring a korban, he wants to make sure that everything will be kedasu kedin, and he'll fulfill his obligation. So what he does is he offers 2 instead of 1. We always want to get 2 for the price of 1. Right? So the second one is called achrayus, and he makes a declaration that in event that the first one that I brought gets lost, or it contracts tumah, or any other psul, they took it out of the azor, whatever might have happened to the animal, here's a second animal that in event the first animal will not be ola limizbeach, the second one is achrayus, and that's my backup for the first. Says Chizkiah, if a person brings 80 lachmei toda, unless he specifies specifically and he explicates that he wants all 80, we assume he wants 40, and the other 40 are backups, what we call achrayus. So again, it's not that he's being overly magnanimous, because you can't be overly magnanimous. The halacha doesn't recognize 80 lechamim, but rather he wants to cover his bases. He wants to guarantee himself that in event the first 40 get lost and we can't find them, we will bring the second 40 as the replacement. The other 40 are what we would say in baseball are on the on-deck circle, or in the, what's it called, the bullpen, right? Rabbi Yochanan holds that if a person brings 80 lechamim, and he didn't specify that 40 out of the 80 should be lachmei toda, what he meant was, in a case of stoma, that all 80 or bust should be lachmei toda. L'das Rabbi Yochanan b'daito l'kadosh es kulam ulahavi karban gadol. He thinks that he's a big shot. he's going to show off, or alternatively, he wants to, divvy up the beautiful Lachmei Tod amongst his family members. He's got a big family. He has, 10 children and 90 grandchildren. So he wants a lot of Lachmei Tod to divvy up. And also he wants to express his gratitude to God for saving him in the Midbar and so forth. So he wants to publicize the Lachmei Tod and share them. If he's insisting on all 80, as we saw earlier, even Chizkiah would say that if he explicitly said all 80, then nothing is chal, not even one lechem becomes niskadosh. Adkan shitas Reb Zera. And now we go on to Abaye. Abaye disagrees with Reb Zera and has a different take on the machlokas between Chizkiah and Reb Yochanan. Everybody holds that his kavanah, when he brought the 80 lachmei toda, is for a carbon gadol. But now we have a halacha called kiddush kli sharis. And what does kiddush kli sharis mean in the context of lachmei toda? It means that the shechita of the zevach, which is with a sakin, the knife itself, has the status of a kli sharis, and it's makadesh the zevach. It's also at the same time a kli sharis to makadesh the lachmei tod in the case of a carbon tod. And the question is, does a kli sharis have a life of its own? Imagine if the kli sharis had a brain. It's interesting how halacha sometimes looks at it with a different perspective on an inanimate object. Imagine if the kli sharis had a brain. So that sakin, if it was able to speak like Bilam's donkey, the sakin would declare, I'm going to be makadesh 40 out of the 80. Because the kli sharis has a life of its own and has a desire, so to speak, to be makadesh zeva. That's what the kli sharis is all about. To sanctify a zeva, kedasu kibir. So this Joe, who's bringing 80 lachmei toda, he wants all 80 to be a carbon gadol, but it can't be done. So now, can we say that his das, his intention, meaning the Bailam's intention, is butter? We have another das, another thinking being that takes over in a case where his das is completely null and void. I know that he wants 80 and a carbon gadol, but he can't have it. So the kli sharis now declares that I'm going to be makadesh 40 out of the 80. That's the sheet of Chizkiah according to Abaye. No one denies that he wants a carbon gadol of 80 lechamim. But says Abaye in interpreting Chizkiah that there's a halacha of kiddush shalom midas bailam, that the kli sharis has the power to be makadesh even against the will of the bailam. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ein alechem is kadesh el midas bailam." There ain't no such thing as allowing an authority and a power to be inherent in a kli sharis to decide against the bailam how to be makadesh the zevach or whatever's inside the kli sharis. Now, if life wasn't complicated enough, hold your horses, because now Rav Papa jumps into the arena and he says, L'divrei hakol, even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that kli sharis mekadshim af shalom midas, which has tremendous applications and ramifications in Kodshim. And very often a person puts something in a kli sharis without any das. We'll have it in kmitza, for example, or maybe even in shirayim, in lachme, in korban mincha. But the machlokes here is within the constellation of kli sharis. There are many, many members of that group called kli sharis. We're going to focus on one member of that group, and that's the sak, the knife. Ladas Chizkiah understood that a sakin is like a classic kli sharis, l'chol davar, which means that a kli sharis has the power, as we said before, l'kadishim without das vayla. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, holds that a sakin is radically different than any other kli sharis. Every kli sharis is makadesh, that which goes into the kli sharis, which means a receptacle. It has what's called a toch. So you put something inside the toch of a kli sharis. The kli sharis is makadesh, and it has the potential to be makadesh afilu shelo b'das vayla. What says Rabbi Yochanan? A knife does not have a toch. It is a kli posh, not a kli with a kabbalah. Therefore, eino mekadesh halechem ela midas. And since everyone agrees that his das, the Baal HaKorban, was to be mekadesh all 80 lechamim, the sakin could not change them. The eina sakin mekadesh es halechem ela midas. And now, again, the last complication of this very complicated sugya is a lishna basra of Rav Papa. There was a different alternative transmission of the words of Rav Papa. L'divrei hakol, on the contrary, from one extreme to the other, ein kli sharis makadesh el midas. Chizkiah, on the other hand, upgraded a sakin to the highest level, above the level of all other kli sharis, exact opposite of the first lishna in Rabbi Yochanan. The sakin mikadeshes af shelo midas. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan holds that a sakin is not superior to any other kli sharis, and it's makadesh only midas. So again, what happened and changed? Two things changed in the lishna basra. The second lashon of Papa. First of all, divrei hakol ein kli sharis makadesh el midas, and secondly, within the context of Chizkiah, we're going to now upgrade a sakin to a very special level. And although all the balance of kli sharis are not capable of being makadesh shelo midas, sakin is makadesh even shelo midas. Now, we're going to end in the next 2 minutes. I just want to show you the paradox of Chizkiah according to the second lishna of Rav Papa. How does Chizkiah, according to that lishna, upgrade a sakin beyond all other kli sharis, to the extent that it's makadesh shelo midas? In this case, it will be makadesh 40 out of 80 lecham, even though the Bible clearly wants a korban goy. Here's the paradox, and we've seen things like this throughout Kodshim, where it goes in two different opposite directions. The arrow goes up and the arrow goes down. Every kli sharis has a toch, with the exception of a sakin. Now the sakin is makadesh without a toch. What does that mean? Does that mean that a sakin is inferior to every kli sharis, or on the contrary, it's superior to every kli sharis? We upgrade the status of the sakin. What the Torah is telling me about a sakin is that it has a power to be makadesh without a toch. So if you know anyone who plays with knives, I remember so many stories I could tell you about raising our children, because we had 3 boys and they love playing with knives. That seems to be a boy's thing. The Swiss knives and all that. A knife is very dangerous. It can cut and fulfill its purpose as a knife without a toch. Your regular run-of-the-mill keli is serving as a toll. I mean, open up your closet, right? So you have pots, you have pans, you have, bowls and plates. I mean, all that has a toll. A spoon has a toll. And don't ask me about a fork, because the fork is really 4 knives, or 3 knives. But a knife can cut without any toll. It has a purpose. And this was Chizkiah's opinion, that every klisharis potentially could be Makadish Shalom Midas, but we have a loch of 8 klisharis Makadish Shalom Midas. But if we have a unique klisharis in the constellation of Caleb, and it's Makadish even without a tov, then all the power to the people. Then that kli has more power than any other klisharis, and it's Makadish Shalom Midas. Hence, the Sakin makes that declaration that I will be Makadesh 40 out of the 80 Lacham. And that's valid. That's the sheet of Chizkiah according to the Lishna Basra of Rav Papa. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. Here on the top of, well, actually, it's more towards the bottom of page Chaf. On the right side, the paragraph that starts Im Yotz.